20 years ago, the terrorist attacks on 9/11 caused two former foes, the US and China, to become friends. That was in order to fight the war on terror. But just how sincere was the Chinese regime in its motivation? And what cost did the US pay after taking the Chinese regime's word for it? In a new special report, we look at the Chinese regime's history of supporting terrorist groups, despite vocally condemning them in front of the West, and what the regime is ultimately working toward. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The year is 2001, and the Chinese regime remains the last major communist country standing. That's following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. At that time, China was struggling to avoid international isolation and trying to figure out how to deal with the George W. Bush administration, which had vowed to take a tougher line with the Chinese regime than Bush's predecessor. U.S.-China relations hit their lowest point in decades after a U.S. spy jet and a Chinese fighter jet collided that April. The U.S. was ready to take on the Chinese regime. Then 9/11 happened.
Make everyone aware that we're going to be seeing some tape.
The tragedy led to a 180-degree change of course for U.S.-China relations.
I was privileged to be in the White House before, during, and after 9/11 to sort of see these policies and plans coming into action and then changing dramatically. For those of us that followed Asia or the China challenge as a key priority, it was a little bit frustrating because the war on terror took a higher priority, and there was a good argument for that.
The Chinese regime didn't hesitate to declare its shock at the incident and quickly express sympathy to the U.S. And America took Beijing at its word. President Bush soon visited China in October and affirmed that there was no hesitation, no doubt that the Chinese would stand with the United States and its people during this terrible time. But the Chinese regime's actions over the past 2 decades have led some to question whether it acted as part of the solution or part of the problem. In this special report, we look at the Chinese regime's history of supporting terrorist groups, despite vocally condemning them when democratic countries are looking, and what it's ultimately trying to achieve. The Taliban is not a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, but it was designated by the United Nations as a terrorist group. During its brief years in power, the Taliban set infidels on fire, performed public execution, tortured ethnic and religious minorities, amputated limbs from people who committed misdemeanors, banned women from receiving education, and most recently, started searching door to door to find people who had worked for the U.S. and Afghanistan's government and take revenge on them. After 9/11, the Taliban harbored its ally al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden and refused to hand him over to the U.S. The organization is also part of the international illicit drug trade circle. The drug trade accounts for up to 60% of the Taliban's annual revenue, earning the group up to $400 million every year. The Chinese Communist Party's ties with the Taliban started decades ago. The same day the World Trade Center fell, the Chinese regime signed an economic cooperation deal with the Taliban. And after 9/11, the UN Security Council voted to ban arms sales to the Taliban unless it shut down bin Laden's terrorist training camps. But China abstained. Since then, Beijing continued secretly negotiating with the Taliban. And in 2001, Indian intelligence officials were quoted by the media alleging that Chinese tech giant Huawei helped supply communication surveillance equipment to Taliban forces in Afghanistan. China's Huawei has a history of violating U.S. sanctions and of doing business with authoritarian regimes like Iran. That's according to allegations from the U.S. Justice Department and several investigative reports from Reuters. Quoting anonymous U.S. intelligence officials, the Washington Times reported that 2 years before 9/11, Huawei worked on Kabul's telecom system. Huawei and Beijing denied the allegations. And China's support continued well after 9/11. The BBC reported in 2007 that the British Army found made-in-China weapons in the aftermath of Taliban attacks on British and American troops. Those arms included Chinese missiles, anti-aircraft guns, landmines, grenades, and components for roadside bombs. More recently, the Chinese regime has become less shy about its relations with the Taliban. China's foreign minister welcomed Taliban leaders with open arms this July, weeks before the terrorists' lightning takeover of Afghanistan. Then in August, news pieces whitewashing the Taliban started appearing in state media reports. A Chinese Communist Party advisor even compared the Taliban to the Chinese regime's own military, which Beijing's propaganda portrays as the savior of the Chinese people. Wang Yizhi is an influential professor. His book was praised by Communist leader Xi Jinping and even designated as a required reading for Communist Party officials.
塔利班举个不恰当的例子，就像解放战争时期的这个解放军一样的。
The People's Liberation Army is the official name for China's military. Wang went on to describe the Taliban as having been demonized by the U.S. In a subsequent video, he argued that just like how the Chinese military represents the will of the Chinese people, maybe in the future in Afghanistan, the one that can represent the Afghan people is the Taliban. Soon after the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, the Chinese regime announced that it would send over $30 million worth of supplies to the country. What's more, Beijing may also be weighing whether to send soldiers to an Afghan airfield in the coming years, the same airfield that was previously occupied by U.S. troops. That's according to a U.S. news report quoting anonymous U.S. officials. That's all for the Chinese regime's Taliban relations. Now let's look to its ties to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group responsible for the loss of over 3,000 innocent American lives, including men, women, and children. This group also receives support from the Chinese regime. In 1998, a group of Chinese nationals visited bin Laden's Afghanistan terrorist camps. There, they paid up to $10 million to Al-Qaeda. That was in exchange for unexploded missiles the U.S. used to attack the terrorist group a year earlier. The deal came to light after Italian police secretly taped a conversation between two Al-Qaeda members. Media reports suggested Beijing could try to reverse engineer those missiles to study U.S. military technology. The Chinese regime may also have supplied Al-Qaeda with weapons, based on a 2002 report by the Washington Times, citing U.S. government sources. When U.S. Special Forces raided Al-Qaeda hideouts, they discovered missiles that were made in China. That's weeks after the terrorist group declared they would target America's commercial flights, and after U.S. officials warned that portable missiles could be one of the group's top weapon choices. The regime may also have helped Al-Qaeda regroup for attacks by offering them a safe haven. In 2002, then Afghan officials told U.S. media that the Chinese regime might be tacitly allowing Islamic radicals to cross into Pakistan to join Al-Qaeda. The Pakistan region, where Al-Qaeda was building up strength, is under Chinese control. But Beijing's ties to terrorist groups don't stop there. China is also one of the biggest countries of origin for weapons used by ISIS, or the Islamic State. That's according to a 2014 report by an independent arms monitoring group. The regime's support of terrorists extends beyond weapons and money. The Chinese regime's propaganda outlet also funds a popular radio station in Afghanistan, known to broadcasting news with an anti-US and anti-NATO lean. What's more, the Chinese regime has exported sensitive military technology to regimes that allegedly sponsor terrorism. That includes Iran, Syria, and Pakistan. Though Beijing's support is documented, no one would argue these terrorists completely answer to the Chinese regime. The reality is much more complicated. First, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to fully control terrorist groups. Second, China is itself concerned about Islamic extremism from the Middle East entering its Xinjiang region and causing trouble on home soil. But one question remains key. Why has Beijing offered support at all? One Chinese professor's speech may shed some light on that reasoning. The speech was given in 2016, but went viral last year as U.S.-China tensions escalated. In it, the Chinese Communist Party insider reveals how the regime plans to get the U.S. out of its way so that communism can spread around the world. One of the tricks mentioned is to make sure the U.S. has at least 4 enemies at all times to keep it occupied. He suggested if the U.S. faces 4 major enemies, it will struggle and lose its direction. He also explained the terrorists are certainly one. Russia is very similar to one, but it's not enough. And added the Chinese regime had tried to prop up other countries opposing the U.S., but didn't succeed. Not long after 9/11, China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization. China's economy has since taken off and integrated with America's and the world's. Its human rights abuses were largely not mentioned publicly by foreign politicians and business people. And in the decades that followed, the regime's intellectual property theft caused what the FBI director called one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history from the U.S. to China. All while the U.S. deals with the Middle East. That's part of the price the U.S. paid amid the war on terror. But now with the 20-year-long Afghanistan war finally coming to an end and the U.S. pulling away from the Middle East, there's much to consider about U.S. foreign policy's next focus. The U.S. Justice Department has reached an agreement that will allow Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou to return to China. Meng will also be allowed to leave Canada from December 1st, 2022, and the United States will withdraw its extradition request to Canada. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Meng Wanzhou, chief financial officer of Chinese telecom giant Huawei, will not be extradited to the United States. She has reached an agreement with the U.S. that will allow her to return to China.